Where were the disciples after Jesus was arrested? Anybody remember? They vamoosed. The Gospels say that the disciples ran away at the arrest of Jesus. So maybe, according to these traditions, maybe Peter was there sort of in a courtyard out removed from the trial. But none of the disciples of Jesus would have been allowed to be present at any trial, whether it was of his high priest or Pilate. They wouldn't have been allowed in. These were peasants from Galilee. They're fishermen. They don't go walking into Pilate's headquarters. So who would have been there to report these different trial things? There are no stenographers in the ancient world sitting down taking notes of these trials. There are no court records. There are no journalists. Nobody was there who later Christians had access to so that they could possibly have known what went on in the trial. So according to most historians, we just say all of this trial stuff was very much made up by later Christians. Why? Because they figured you had to have a trial if you're going to have Jesus condemned. And so they figured, well, what would have taken place? These gospel writers, or maybe they're using traditions that developed before them, they're using traditions that develop because people just say, well, what would have happened at Jesus' trial? What's likely to have happened? And then they make up that likeliness and they put that into the story. Now, so you've got a couple of different situations where we historians are very, very skeptical about some of the basic aspects of the Gospel's accounts as far as what they tell us about the historical Jesus. The birth narratives, we just throw up our hands. The trials before Pilate, no, probably none of it rises to the level of history. But this leads to a couple of different problems. The first one I'm going to talk about is, so what? And I'm saying this because once critical scholars start talking about the historical Jesus, we immediately start stepping into sand traps. On the one hand, we have good Christian people who are a bit afraid that if you start questioning the historical reliability of the Gospels, then you're going to undermine every aspect of Christian faith. If the birth narratives are not as they say they are in the Gospels, then how can you trust any of it to be true? And if none of it is true, how do you even know that Jesus actually even existed? Or even if he did exist, how do you know that he wasn't a liar or a magician or just a bum? How do you, and if that's true, why have faith? Why not just give up the whole thing? So on the one hand, you've got Christians who are very threatened by using typical historical tools on the Gospels and the very question of the historical Jesus. On the other hand, we have just as many people who are anti-Christian and who they want to grab onto this and say, aha, notice how reputable scholars like Dale Martin, Woolsey Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, points out that not everything in the Gospels is reliably history. Well, that means it's all a bunch of bunk. And every Christian in the world is basing their faith on things that are known by scholars to be lies. Well, that's not exactly right either, is it? So on both sides, you get some people who grab onto any sort of idea that historians would say these are discrepancies in the Gospels, or these are places where we don't have historical evidence to back us up, and they want to run with that precisely in order to impugn the faith of Christians. Now, so scholars have to be very careful. What we basically want to say, there was actually one or two scholars in the 19th century, reputable scholars, Bruno Bauer was one of them, a German scholar, who denied that Jesus ever existed. He just said it was all, even the person of Jesus was a myth created by the church. And you'll find every once in a while somebody on the, on the web or internet or something, or in some crazy blog saying that Jesus never existed. But reputable historical scholars all admit that Jesus of Nazareth existed. There was a guy back there, Jesus of Nazareth. There's just too much evidence that he existed, and it's just not controvertible when it comes to reliable historical evidence. But that's a big difference from saying, yes, we believe he existed, and there are some things we think we can say about him, to accepting all of the gospel materials as reliable. So scholars basically are caught in the middle of saying, we believe there was a Jesus of Nazareth. We believe we might even be able to say some things as historians about who he was, what he said, what he did, why he may have been executed, and that sort of thing. But that means we have to use critical historical tools to analyze these faith-based texts, these theological texts, what are indeed, in some cases, mythological texts. We read theological texts to try to figure out what we can say historically. And that leads to the other issue. I keep saying the historical Jesus, because a whole lot of people have the idea that once I give you the historical Jesus, then you've got the real Jesus. You've got Jesus as he really was, and therefore Jesus as he really is. Now the problem with that is that theologians, and I can put on my historical hat most of the time because I actually have a job as a historian. I don't really have a job as a theologian, so I kind of call myself sometimes an amateur theologian. But if I want to put on my amateur theologian hat, I can make a case for you why the historical Jesus is not a very good foundation for Christian faith. It's not reliable as a foundation of Christian faith. It's not sufficient as a foundation for Christian faith. The theological Jesus, the Jesus of Christian confession, is not the historical Jesus. The Jesus of theological confession is the Jesus that matches what the church has traditionally believed about Jesus. So, for example, Jesus that matches the creeds, a Jesus that matches Christian confessions. So one of the most important things for Christian confession, for example, is would you lose your faith if you believe that Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem but was rather born in Nazareth? Probably most Christians would probably say, well, no, that's not really that important. What's the most central thing for most Christians for Christian faith? Do you believe that somehow God was in Jesus Christ reconciling the world to himself, to quote the Apostle Paul? Or do you believe that Jesus Christ is divine? Do you believe that Jesus is God? Do you believe that Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh? That's a fundamental aspect of Christian faith for most Christians. But notice, that's not something that historians can pronounce about one way or another. There's no possible way that I, practicing history by the normal historiographical tools of history, could tell you whether God was in Jesus Christ. Is there? I mean, just think about it. How would I test that? How would I figure it out? What would count as a positive proof? What would count as a non-controvertible negative truth? There's no such thing. So when I'm talking to you about the historical Jesus, I have to get over several hurdles. One of the hurdles is trying to show you that the historical Jesus is a construction made by historians practicing the typical trade of modern historians.